right. Thank you so much to our last speakers. And this is going to be our final session of the day here on the West Stage. Our next discussion is about how to leverage public-private partnerships for inclusive approaches to forced displacement and migration. And we're going to hear from speakers who represent different sectors to combine expertise and find solutions to this very pressing and timely issue. So please welcome to the stage to lead the conversation, Ishaan Tharoor and our esteemed panel.
Great to see you all. Thank you to Concordia for having us. And this is a tremendous occasion always. But today we're talking about one of the toughest issues in global politics right now. And I'm really delighted to be joined by a terrific panel. To my immediate right is Basma Alawee, the Deputy Executive Director of the Community Sponsorship Hub. Kelly Clements, the Deputy High Commissioner of the UNHCR, the UN's refugee agency, and Kate Brick, the Executive Director of the Advocacy Lab, Refugee Advocacy Lab at Refugees International. It's a very short conversation, so I'm going to spare you a preamble from me. Kelly, let's start. We were on the stage a few years ago, maybe before the pandemic, talking about very similar issues. And for all the optimism and energy that comes out of Concordia, the broader global situation has gotten worse. We have record displacement, we have entrenched horrible conflicts in various parts of the world, famine, and of course the advent of all sorts of toxic national politics around refugees and migration as well. Could you set the scene for us in terms of what you're dealing with as the UNHCR, the world's most important refugee agency?
Thank you, Ishaan, and greetings to everybody. It's nice to see you and see you again and be on this great panel with my colleagues here. Yes, I was recalling back, I think it has been pre-pandemic since we were last together on the stage talking about forced displacement, and I think I said at that point we were at record levels. And if I'm not mistaken, it was about 80 million people that were forced to flee for conflict, violence, persecution, and other reasons. And now we're over 120 million people forced to flee. Most are staying within the boundaries of their own countries, close to home, but still displaced and in great need. And then a large number of refugees as well. And you talked about it a little bit, Ishaan, but this is in a context where we're not just talking about war and conflict in places like Myanmar, for example, or in Afghanistan, or now the Middle East, or Venezuela, south of us, or Sudan. But we're also talking about some of what we've seen that was built in after the pandemic with regard to inequalities. Climate has become a massive driver of people, and so in terms of that preparation, and people that are forced to flee are generally in parts of the world that are in low and middle income countries, and those that are more susceptible to climate hazards. So all of that, not to bring the room down, but it's not a very pretty picture, and there are a lot of people in need that we need to support.
Kate, if we can turn to perhaps the situation in the US. Obviously, we're in a very volatile and intense election cycle right now, where the national conversation on refugees, on migration, is quite troubling, and not particularly hospitable to perhaps serious conversations about what needs to be done to address refugee needs. Could you talk a bit more on, say, the local and state level where you work and where your colleagues are more involved, on what is happening on these levels, and how are you weathering the kind of broader national conversations?
A lot is happening. A lot of really exciting, important, innovative things are happening, and I think in large part that has been in response not just to the current environment that we're in. This isn't the first time that we've had an incredibly challenging, politicized, factless conversation on these issues in the national conversation, and a lot of the work that has evolved, especially I would say over the last 10 years, has really happened in response to that, and in response to decades of just sort of an absence of federal movement on immigration reform that we have needed for so long in this country, where people seeking safety and immigrants really have the opportunity to be successful and to thrive, or not, depending on the policy landscape, really happens at the state and at the local level, and is dependent on what kind of city that they live in, what kind of state environment that they're in. And what we've seen is this huge increase in localities and in states recognizing that welcoming people, whether they're seeking safety or coming here for economic reasons, is a net benefit, and that we will all do better as a community and as a society if we have policies in place that will allow people to be successful. And so at the city level, we now have more than 300 cities that are part of this welcoming network that are thinking intentionally, and in many cases working directly with the business community to think about what can we do to make sure that everybody in our city can be successful. What are the economic barriers that we need to reduce? What are the ways that we can get people back into the workforce? Make sure they have access to education. And similarly, that's happening at the state level as well. Last year, we saw a record number of policies introduced in states across the political spectrum that really thought about what can we do to tangibly create an environment that's going to allow people to be successful and thrive.
Basma, I would just turn to you and ask you a similar question. Given the way your organization works and where it's located, what are the kinds of real needs that you're seeing and that you're trying to address?
Thank you so much.
And I suppose perhaps tell the audience a bit about your organization.
Yes. Thank you so much. And I think we just heard that the needs keep increasing. And I think while the needs are increasing, we really need to come up with more innovative, durable solutions that could really meet the needs. And in the past 4 years, within the current administration, we have seen a great innovative way of expanding the refugee resettlement and welcoming work happening in the United States. And because of the amazing generosity and really the many community members who stepped in to welcome Afghans and Ukrainians and Cuban, Haitian, Nicaraguan, and Venezuelans, the administration was really encouraged to launch the Welcome Corps, which is a private-public partnership of a program that we have a community sponsorship hub along with consortium partners, the privilege to be selected to implement that program. We have seen, since the program was launched a year and a half now, over 100,000 Americans signed up to welcome refugees they know or they don't know through the program. That just tells me when you give the agency to the people to take part of this work, they will never put you down. And when we put a perspective to and really narrative to numbers, that's over 100,000 Americans could be potentially welcoming close to 60,000 refugees. And they come in a group of 5 individuals in local communities, put up a welcome plan, fundraise locally, put their own private money to really welcome refugees. And each refugee, to bring it in a perspective, it's a $2,425 to help with the resettlement and integration for the first 3 months. And if we put that in numbers, over 100 millions have been really committed to welcome refugees. So we are seeing a movement of welcoming all over the United States. And while we are going through really hard time now, and it's been forever, but we are now seeing more people stepping in to support the effort of welcoming, because we do believe as a community that this is the right things to do for any human beings who need support in a time of crisis.
Kelly, I mean, let's take that forward. We did speak a few years ago, and sadly, a lot has not changed, or things have gotten worse, broadly speaking. But what has changed in terms of the work that you're doing, in terms of some of the public-private cooperation that UNHCR is engaged in terms of the thinking around bridging some of the gaps and needs that exist in the various places that UNHCR is called to work?
Well, this is, yeah, I think it's a very good next step, because we've heard a little bit from Kate and Basma in terms of how do we look very differently at need. And when we talk about refugees or people forced to flee, I think there is a logical next step that what can I give in order to make that person's life better? And what's really flipped in terms of changing the way that we deliver protection and aid is that we're looking for solutions much earlier, and we're looking at refugees and displaced as agents of their own change. So involving them very quickly. So an emergency strikes, you're not waiting months or years to, for example, educate the next generation or find ways that people can employ themselves quickly so that they can start rebuilding their lives as quickly as possible. That's happening here in the United States as we've just been hearing about. But around the globe, even in those places, in those host communities, how do you look at refugees as assets in a community, whether it's in a United States city or a city or a village in Chad? And so the private sector, what we've seen in the last 4 or 5 years in particular, there's been a springboard forward to see how can they be part of the solution as well. Certainly resources are important, but expertise is equally important, in some areas even more important. We've been talking a lot this week in the General Assembly about the digital compact that was adopted on Sunday. This is a way, if it's used well, and we talk a lot about AI for good, making sure we use AI safely as well, but how do you then use that to deliver more, faster, better? How do you use that to involve more, connect refugees and displaced, perhaps in even more remote parts of the world? And we've got strategic partnerships now with businesses and foundations that want to employ refugees, that see this as good business to do good, as we've heard a whole lot about. Those that want to help us be able to reach even more people. We've been talking a lot about a digital gateway, where it's not a very passive way for refugees to then, for example, get an ID, be able to use services using digital wallets and so on. So, I mean, there are many, many businesses that are now involved in these efforts and trying to use their own capabilities and those of their workforce to actually make a real difference in these areas. And also, given that I'm sitting in between two incredible advocates for refugees and refugee protection, it's also about the voice. And here's where we see businesses stepping forward and saying, we want to welcome people into our businesses as employees, but also into our communities. And so I think that narrative, which is we have to really work to ensure that the narrative is about this is not something to fear. These are people to welcome. And that, I think, there has been, despite the political polarization in some parts of the world, and including in this country, that's what we have to really capitalize on and build and extend.
Let's stick to that theme of narrative. Kate, obviously, I don't want to be a downer again, but as somebody who is mired on social media and in the national conversation, I can't but not bring up the hideous misinformation that's spread around Springfield, Ohio. Do you have any reaction to that? And I suppose my actual question to you is, how do we tell better stories about refugees and migrants?
Thank you for asking, and I have a lot of thoughts about Springfield, Ohio. Ohio is a state where the lab works and supports an incredible coalition called Vibrant Ohio, which is made up of 6 cities from across the state of Ohio who all believe that welcoming newcomers makes the entire state better. And so I think the first part of your question, what we heard about Springfield and the horrible lies that were spread took flight and turned into something that none of us could have expected. But I think it was also a really important opportunity to highlight the leadership in Springfield and in cities throughout the state and the country who have taken this moment that is very dark and upsetting and used it to set the record straight about what it means to be a city that has seen a lot of people come over a short period of time, and how the reality is in Springfield and in so many cities across Ohio, across the Great Lakes region broadly, and across the whole country, I would say, there have been huge economic benefits for people coming in, revitalizing economic corridors, filling the workforce, starting new businesses. And in communities like Ohio and other parts of the country, especially, that reversed economic decline. And I think that that's a narrative that we need to remember. But at the same time, we need to remember that these are people and they have their own stories and their own incredibly powerful narratives about what it means to come to this country, regardless of the reason why. And part of the work that we do at the lab is to really help our partners across the country have conversations that are facts-based and that are a way to build bridges instead of build barriers and deeper dive into misinformation. How can we have a constructive conversation around what this means, recognizing that people have concerns, misunderstandings, fear, frustration around what is right now a very challenging issue, and we can't pretend that it's not. We can't pretend that everything's fine and everyone's overreacting. Part, I think, of having an effective conversation is acknowledging, the frustration that people feel, but then also talking about what the solutions are and what the reality actually is. And in Springfield, it was really powerful to see the mayor speak immediately about what the reality is on the ground there. We saw mayors and business leaders from across Ohio set the record straight as well. And the other piece of this is making sure that those who have that experience are the ones leading the conversation. We did a poll a year ago at the lab to test public sentiment towards refugee resettlement. And it found overwhelming support for refugee resettlement across party lines, across different demographic indicators. That support jumped 20 points if somebody personally knew a refugee, but only 14% of people said that they knew someone. And so I think we have a lot of work to do when we think about shaping this conversation and having a facts-based narrative to make sure that the people for whom this is their lives can share the whole breadth of their story and what brought them to the United States, what they do here now, and how they're so deeply involved in their communities.
And I would editorialize that there's a certain responsibility on the media as well, that perhaps before we invent stories about people eating cats, we can pay attention to some of these communities before we have to, because of the conversation. Basma, I'd love to conclude with you because, of course, you're doing incredible work, but you also have a very powerful personal story. So I think, close the loop that we started here and that Kate brought us to when it comes to the importance of telling these stories and really highlighting the kind of personal, private, and sort of public sector involvement in certain situations in uplifting refugees in these societies.
Thank you, and thank you so much for all of the great answers. I actually came to the US back in 2010 as a refugee myself, and back home I actually was a chemical engineer, and moving to the US I really faced hardship navigating work, school, really even navigating my daily life. Also, I faced some of these narratives and comments in streets. Every time I walk by myself, I find myself that I always needed to tell people why I end up being in the US as a refugee, because I was always told, why you're here? You need to be deported. And I always needed to tell people that actually I am here because my husband was supporting the US troops in Iraq and he saved many lives, and that was not a choice for me and him to come to the US rather than we are escaping the threat of his safety. And when we came to the US, we were told here that this is not the place to be. So navigating all of this, I really found the power of storytelling was really important, but also found myself, what's really protected me, the communities I created every time I tell my story. And that's why I see the power of welcoming work and the Welcome Corps and Welcome Corps on campus and Welcome Corps at work. We are having now a movement of welcomers. And to Kate's point, every time someone know a refugee, their full perspective change. What if they are actually welcoming refugees? That's whole dynamic change because they will be part of that journey and understanding how hard actually for us to come to the US as refugees. But I'm really excited for this movement of welcoming, and I hopefully the media will support us in pushing that narrative further.
Well, thank you all. We're wrapping up here. This has been a conversation that we could have at much greater length, but I think it's been really important to highlight that despite, again, the conversations that my colleagues are part of in very unfortunate ways, there is real work being done, real connections being made, and so much work to do. So thank you very much. And Have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for